Get comfortable. Seriously, take a moment. Pull the duvet up a bit if you need to, turn the pillow over to the cooler side if that's your thing, and just settle in. There's no rush here. There's nowhere you need to be. Tonight we're going through the entire story of South Park. The real one. Not just the greatest hits, not just the controversy reel, but the whole thing, from two barely functioning film students in Colorado making something out of construction paper and stubbornness, all the way to one of the longest-running animated shows in television history, still somehow airing new episodes in 2025. Nearly 3 decades of this thing, 4 boys at a bus stop in the snow, billions of dollars, death threats, Oscar nominations, a blanket ban across an entire country. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, one of the most genuinely strange and fascinating creative partnerships television has ever produced. We'll get to the theories too, of course. The ones about Kenny that completely changed how people read the show. The ones about Cartman that are honestly a little unsettling once you lay them all out. The member berries theory, which sounds absurd until it doesn't. And a few others that the show has, depending on how charitably you're reading things, either confirmed, denied, or simply ignored while continuing to pile up evidence. But we're not in a hurry. We'll wander through all of it at a nice, easy pace. If you happen to drift off somewhere in the middle, that's entirely fine. That's sort of the whole point. The story will still be here if you want to come back to it. So, South Park. Let's start from the very beginning, which, depending on how you count it, is either a film school dorm room in Boulder, Colorado in the early 1990s, or a VHS tape that got passed around Hollywood in 1995 and changed everything. We'll start with the dorm room. It's a better story. Trey Parker grew up in Conifer, Colorado, which is a small mountain town southwest of Denver, sitting somewhere around 8,000 feet of elevation. It snows a lot in Conifer, the winters are long, and the landscape is beautiful, and there is not a lot else going on. He was drawing and performing and making up stories from a very early age, and by the time he got to high school, he was doing musical theater and writing songs, and generally being the kind of kid who has too much creative energy for one small mountain town to comfortably contain. Matt Stone grew up in Littleton, Colorado, which is closer to Denver and a bit more suburban, but still very much Colorado. He was into music and had a dry, observational sense of humor, and he was sharp in a way that read less like performance and more like he was just quietly noticing things that other people walked straight past. The two of them met at the University of Colorado Boulder in the early 1990s in the Film Studies program. Parker has described the meeting as fairly immediate. They had the same taste, the same references, the same low tolerance for anything that felt pretentious or self-serious. They started making things together almost straight away. Short films, sketches, anything that let them point a camera at something and try to make it funny. The quality of those early efforts varied quite a bit, but the sensibility was consistent. They liked comedy that felt dangerous in some way, that pushed past where most people were comfortable stopping. One of their early student films was called Cannibal, the Musical, which was a full-length musical comedy about Alfred Packer, a real historical figure who was the only American ever convicted of cannibalism. Parker directed it, co-wrote the music, and starred in it. Stone produced. The film was shot on a tiny budget and finished in 1993. It eventually got a proper distribution release through Trauma Entertainment in 1996, by which point Parker and Stone were already famous for something else entirely. But the film itself is a genuinely good indicator of who they were creatively. Interested in dark material, capable of genuine craft, and absolutely unwilling to take either the darkness or the craft too seriously. Now, before South Park existed as a television show, before there was a pitch or a pilot or a network deal, there was an animated short, 2 of them actually, and the first one almost nobody saw. Jesus vs. Frosty was made in 1992, which puts it in Parker and Stone's very early student years. It's rough, even by the standards of things you'd expect from college students with limited equipment. The animation is crude stop motion using paper cutouts. The characters are recognizable if you squint as proto-versions of what would eventually become the South Park Boys. There's a round, fat kid who sounds a bit like Cartman, and a few others in winter coats. The plot involves Frosty the Snowman turning evil and Jesus showing up to sort things out. It has no budget and no polish, and it's basically a curiosity at this point, a historical artifact. The one that actually matters is The Spirit of Christmas, Jesus vs. Santa, made in 1995. By this point, Parker and Stone had graduated and were trying to establish themselves in the industry. The short was commissioned by Brian Graydon, a development executive at Fox at the time, who had seen some of their earlier work. He gave them somewhere between $200 and $2,000. The number varies depending on who's telling the story, to make him an animated holiday card he could send to friends and industry contacts. What they produced was a crude, violent, profane animated short in which Jesus Christ and Santa Claus get into a street fight over the meaning of Christmas while 4 boys watch: Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny. The character designs are very close to what would appear on television 2 years later. The voices are clearly Parker and Stone doing characters they'd already thought through. The humor is exactly what you'd expect: gleefully offensive, structurally tight, and genuinely funny if you're in the right mood for it. Graydon sent VHS copies of the short to people he knew in Hollywood. He sent quite a few of them, and the tape started moving around in a way that Graydon hadn't quite anticipated, being copied and shared and passed from hand to hand. Before long, the short was circulating through entertainment industry circles in a way that nothing really circulated before the internet existed. Person to person, tape to tape, with people calling each other to say, "Have you seen this thing?" It became something of an underground phenomenon. Comedy Central executives saw the short. They were interested. The network at this point in the mid-1990s was still relatively young and looking for things that would define its identity. They had The Daily Show, they had some other properties, but they didn't have anything that felt genuinely transgressive in the way Jesus vs. Santa did. They reached out to Parker and Stone and asked if they'd be interested in developing the short into a series. Parker and Stone said yes. Of course they said yes. They were 2 guys in their mid-20s who'd made a paper cutout short film on somebody else's money, and suddenly a cable network wanted to give them a television show. The development process moved relatively quickly. Parker and Stone pitched the show as being about 4 boys in a small Colorado mountain town, based loosely on the kind of places they'd both grown up in, getting into absurd situations that satirized American culture. The show would be animated in the paper cutout style of the short, at least aesthetically. It would be crude and deliberately rough-looking, which was both an artistic choice and, at that point, a practical necessity. It would not be a children's cartoon despite featuring children as main characters. The pilot episode was called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. And here's a detail I find genuinely charming about the origins of South Park. That first episode was produced using real physical construction paper. Parker and Stone and a small team cut out characters and backgrounds by hand, photographed them frame by frame in a process that was essentially traditional stop-motion animation, and assembled the whole thing that way. It took 3 months. 3 months to make one 22-minute episode of television. That's important to hold on to because the production process the show would later develop could not be more different from that. But the pilot was made by hand, literally with paper and scissors and a camera. After the pilot, everything shifted to computer animation. They built a digital pipeline designed to replicate the aesthetic of the paper cutout animation, the slightly jerky movement, the 2-dimensional look, the deliberate visual flatness, but produced using software. The goal was always to preserve the look of something handmade while dramatically reducing the time it took to produce. And the show went to air on August 13, 1997. The premiere drew roughly 980,000 viewers, a 1.3 Nielsen rating. For a basic cable channel in 1997, that was a reasonable start. Not spectacular, but enough to suggest people were curious. And it grew from there rather quickly. By the 10th episode of Season 1, the rating had climbed to 6.4. Comedy Central's subscriber base, which had been sitting at around 9 million households before the show launched, jumped to approximately 50 million within a year. The show didn't just perform well for the network, it effectively transformed the network. It was the single biggest factor in Comedy Central becoming a destination channel rather than something you flip past. And then there was the Season 1 finale, Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, and its follow-up at the start of Season 2. These two episodes drew somewhere around 6.2 to 6.4 million viewers and posted an 8.2 Nielsen rating. That rating stood for years as the record for a non-sports program on basic cable. They remain, as of 2025, the most watched episodes in South Park's entire history. None of this happened because of a marketing campaign or a promotional push. It happened because people told each other to watch it. Word of mouth, the same mechanism that had spread the VHS tape 2 years earlier. People watched South Park and then rang somebody and said, "You have to watch this program, it's completely deranged, watch it now, it didn't get canceled." Right, so we've established the timeline so far: 2 Colorado boys, 1 VHS tape, 1 cable network, 1 premiere. But the story of the show getting to air properly, the mechanics of it, the specific decisions that shaped what the program was, that's worth sitting with for a bit, because a lot of the show's DNA got set in those early decisions and never really changed. The pitch meeting at Comedy Central, by all accounts, went well. Parker and Stone were clear about what they wanted to make. They weren't trying to sneak anything past anyone. They showed the Jesus versus Santa short. They talked about the characters, the setting, the tone. Comedy Central, to their credit, seemed to understand what they were getting into. This wasn't a case of a network being shocked by the content later. They knew what they were commissioning. The show was always supposed to be exactly this offensive and exactly this pointed. South Park was, from its very first episode, rated TVMA, which might not sound remarkable now in an era where that rating is everywhere, but in 1997 it was. South Park holds the distinction of being the first weekly television program ever to be rated TVMA. There's something almost administrative sounding about that fact, but the implications were real. It meant Comedy Central was not pretending this was for kids, it was on late. It was clearly adult. That gave Parker and Stone a latitude that very few shows had enjoyed before. The production pipeline for the first series was still being figured out as they went. After the paper cutout pilot, which as we mentioned took 3 months, the team shifted to a computer-animated workflow designed to look like the original cutout aesthetic. The early software setup involved Corel Draw and a program called Alias Power Animator running on Silicon Graphics workstations, which, if any of that means anything to you, tells you something about how early and how specific this whole system was. Later, from around Season 5, the whole operation moved to Autodesk Maya, where it still runs. But from the beginning, the technical goal was the same: make something that looked handmade while being producible at the speed television requires. The speed part is something we'll get to in detail later, because it's one of the most extraordinary things about South Park as a production. For now, just note that even in the first series, the team was learning how to make these episodes fast. The first series ran 13 episodes, from August 13, 1997 through to February of 1998. And even within those 13 episodes, you can watch the show working out what it wants to be. The very early episodes lean hard on the shock value, alien probes, bodily functions, celebrity parody, deliberately offensive language. But even in that first series, there are episodes that show a different instinct at work. Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, the 4th episode, which addressed gay rights and tolerance in a way that felt genuinely unusual for the time, earned the show its first Emmy nomination in 1998 for Outstanding Animated Program. a show that had been on air for barely a year that featured fart jokes and cartoon children being killed, got nominated for an Emmy. That tells you something. The cultural explosion that came with Series 1 was not something Comedy Central had entirely anticipated. The show became a phenomenon in a way that felt almost accidental, or at least faster than anyone had planned for. By 1998, South Park was everywhere. The characters were on t-shirts, which sold 30 million worth in that first year alone. People who had never watched the show knew who Cartman was. It had crossed over from a cable program watched by college students late at night into a genuine piece of mainstream culture. And that crossing over created its own complications because the show was genuinely not for everyone and had never claimed to be. Parents who'd heard their kids quoting it or who'd caught a few minutes of an episode were sometimes appalled. There were complaints, there were op-eds, there were people who felt very strongly that this program should not exist, and they were very vocal about it. Parker and Stone's response to this in the early years and pretty much ever since was to keep making the show and let the noise be noise. They did apologize, they didn't moderate. If anything, the controversy seemed to energize them because the show's willingness to go places that other programs wouldn't go was not just a feature, it was the point. The point was to examine things, to poke at them, to make people uncomfortable enough to actually think about whatever was being satirized. There's a specific thing that the show was doing in those first couple of series that I think gets overlooked in retrospect, partly because the shock element was so loud that it drowned everything else out. South Park from the beginning was interested in hypocrisy. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake, not offensive material as an end in itself, but the particular kind of comedy that comes from watching people say one thing and do another. The adults in South Park are almost uniformly useless, cowardly, self-interested, and prone to following whatever trend or moral panic is currently most convenient. The children, despite being foul-mouthed and frequently terrible to each other, are usually more sensible than the adults around them. That inversion, kids as the voice of reason in a world of irrational adults, was there from the beginning, and it became one of the show's most consistent and reliable comic engines. Season 2 arrived in April 1998 and ran for 18 episodes, which is the largest episode order the show ever produced in a single season. It was also, by Parker and Stone's own later admission, a season they were not entirely happy with. They've said in DVD commentaries for the third series that they were deeply unsatisfied with most of Season 2. The show was still finding its footing creatively, still working out where it could go and what was actually worth saying versus what was just noise. The 18-episode order was generous, but probably too long given where they were creatively. They made it through. They kept going. And then in 1999, before Season 3 even aired, they made a film. Before we get to the film, I want to spend some time with the characters themselves, because one of the things that gets compressed in the origin story is just how specifically drawn these four boys are. They're not types, or they are types in the way that all great comic characters are types, but each of them has a specificity underneath the type that gives them staying power. Let's start with Stan Marsh, because he's probably the most straightforwardly autobiographical of the four. Stan is, in rough terms, the normal one. He's the kid who usually reacts to whatever absurdity is unfolding, the way a sensible, decent person would react, with disbelief, with mild nausea, with the suspicion that the adults around him have all lost their minds simultaneously. He has a girlfriend, Wendy. He has a best friend, Kyle. He's not the funniest character on the show, and he's not supposed to be. He's the anchor. Parker has said in various interviews over the years that Stan is the character he most identifies with, or at least identified with in the early years. The perspective is Parker's, the sense of being a reasonably well-meaning person who keeps ending up in situations that no reasonably well-meaning person should have to navigate. There's something almost melancholy about Stan in the better episodes. A quiet exhaustion underneath all the comedy, like he's one bizarre incident away from just going home and staying there. Kyle Broflovsky is the Jewish character, which is important not because the show makes a big deal of it, it does, but ironically, but because Stone based Kyle partly on himself. Stone is Jewish, grew up in Colorado, and the particular experience of being the slightly outside kid in a majority Christian environment is something he's referenced in interviews. Kyle's Jewish identity is a source of comedy in the show, but it's also handled with more care than you might expect from South Park. When the show jokes about Kyle being Jewish, it's usually also joking about the people making the jokes, if that makes sense. The satire tends to cut inward as much as it cuts outward. Kyle is also the moral compass of the group in a way that makes him occasionally unbearable to the other characters. He has principles, he believes in things, he gets genuinely angry when he thinks something is wrong. This makes him the perfect foil for Cartman, which is a dynamic the show has returned to so many times that at this point it's basically the structural spine of the whole series. Kyle cares, Cartman doesn't. Kyle's caring is what Cartman exploits over and over across hundreds of episodes. Now, Cartman, Eric Theodore Cartman, is not an easy character to talk about quickly, and we'll spend more time with him later in a section of his own. But for now, the origin, Cartman started as a fat, selfish, loud bully. A type. A placeholder for the specific kind of American entitlement that Parker found genuinely interesting to satirize. Parker has referenced an archetype, the entitled self-righteous child who believes the world owes him deference, as something he'd always found funnier than straightforward villainy. Cartman in Season 1 is unpleasant, but he's recognizably human. He's the kind of kid you probably went to school with. What he became over subsequent seasons is something else, and we'll get there. One thing worth knowing about Cartman's voice, Parker does it and has been doing it since the beginning. The voice is partly inspired by a kind of nasal, wheedling mid-American accent, with a specific quality of self-pity mixed with aggression. Parker has described it as the voice of someone who always feels like they're being persecuted even when they're the one doing the persecuting, which is a fairly precise description of the character. Kenny McCormick is the poor kid. He lives in a beat-up house on the wrong side of town. His parents argue and drink. His clothes are old and worn, and he wears an orange parka with the hood pulled so tight you can barely see his face and can never quite make out what he's saying. The character was based on a real person, a kid Parker knew growing up in Colorado whose name was actually Kenny, who wore a similar coat and who was absent from school so often that jokes were made about it. In the cartoon, the joke became something rather darker. Kenny doesn't just miss school sometimes, Kenny dies. But more on that later, much more. The voice for Kenny is usually provided by Stone, who delivers most of Kenny's dialogue in a muffled, mostly incomprehensible mumble. In the early seasons, you could sometimes make out what he was saying if you listened carefully, and it was almost always filthy. Later, the show got a bit more deliberate about the muffled voice, occasionally using it as a joke in itself. The one character who might have something actually important to say is the one nobody can understand. And then there's Butters Stotch, who didn't start as a main character at all. Leopold Butters Stotch appeared unnamed in the pilot episode as an unremarkable background figure, just another kid in class. He was gradually given more lines across seasons 2 and 3, and writers started noticing that there was something about the character that worked. He's naive. He's genuinely innocent in a way that none of the 4 main boys really are. He trusts people. He gets taken advantage of constantly, most often by Cartman, and he never quite learns the lesson. He's not stupid, he just has an enormous capacity for hope that the world around him keeps failing to extinguish. When Kenny was temporarily written out of the show in Season 5 and Season 6, which happened for reasons we'll get to, Butters was promoted to the role of 5th main character. He's been in that position ever since, and honestly, the show is better for it. He adds something the original 4 can't quite provide, which is genuine earnestness without irony. And then there is Randy Marsh. Randy was introduced as Stan's dad, a supporting character, a comic relief figure, a pleasant enough presence, reliable for a laugh when the episode needed a befuddled parent to react to something absurd. In the early seasons, he's fine. He's exactly what he needs to be. Stan's slightly embarrassing father, no more. What happened to Randy Marsh over the following 2 decades is one of the most gradual and surprising character evolutions in television. We'll go into that properly later. For now, just note that he started as background furniture and became, depending on which era of the show you're watching, arguably the main character. Parker has essentially admitted this. The trajectory of South Park, if you watch it over its full run, is partly the story of Randy Marsh slowly taking over his own son's show. One last character worth mentioning in the context of Origins: the theme song. The South Park theme was composed and performed by Primus, specifically by Les Claypool, the bassist and vocalist. The original version from Season 1 features call and response vocals between Claypool and the boys. It runs at 144 BPM in 4/4 time. The theme has been remixed and rearranged several times over the show's run. There was a techno version, a bluegrass version, a rock version featuring Claypool's custom Wamala electric bass. But the Primus DNA has stayed underneath all of it. There's something pleasantly offbeat about the choice. A bass-heavy, slightly menacing art rock band making the theme song for a cartoon about 4-year-olds. It fits. The thing about the early seasons of South Park, seasons 1 through 4, roughly, is that they have a very specific energy that the show never quite replicated later. Not because the show got worse exactly, though there are periods we'll talk about where it did, but because the early seasons have this quality of something being invented in real time. You can feel the writers testing what the program can contain, what the audience will accept, what the network will actually push back on. The answer to that last question, by the way, was not very much. Comedy Central was largely permissive in those early years, partly because the show's success was so enormous and so fast that it would have been difficult to argue with, and partly because Parker and Stone had an instinct for finding the line and then drawing it somewhere more interesting than where other people expected it to be. Season 1 established the basic formula. The boys get into something: an alien invasion, a volcanic eruption, a debate about the school flag, a wrestling match with their parents. It escalates to an absurd degree, and somewhere in the middle of the escalation, the show makes a point about something real. The point is rarely delivered with a wink. The show trusts its audience to find it. A few things from the early seasons that are worth flagging as genuinely good television, not just shock comedy. Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride is the 4th episode ever made, and it's about Stan's dog, Sparky, being gay. Big Gay Al runs a sanctuary for gay animals. The episode handles its subject matter with more genuine warmth than most adult programming of the era was capable of. It was nominated for an Emmy. George Clooney appeared in it, providing only bark sounds for Sparky. The episode is almost 30 years old and it still reads as kind. Mr. Henke, the Christmas Pooh, introduced one of the show's most famous recurring characters, a talking piece of excrement who appears at Christmas as a symbol of holiday spirit. This sounds like pure shock comedy, and on one level it is, but the episode is structured as a meditation on belief in childhood and what happens when the adults around a kid don't believe what the kid knows to be true. It's a strange little episode with a surprising amount of feeling in it. Pink Eye, the first Halloween episode, is a zombie outbreak story that manages to be a fairly competent piece of horror parody, while also finding room to make jokes about death and cosmetics and social conformity. The show was from the beginning much more interested in genre than it was usually given credit for. What changed in seasons 3 and 4 was a sharpening of the satirical instinct. The show started going after bigger targets with more precision. Chin Pokemon in Season 3 is a parody of the Pokemon craze that's also a fairly sharp commentary on American consumerism and cultural imperialism. Timmy, also Season 4, put a character with severe disabilities at the center of an episode about inspiration porn and the way society processes disability. These are not simple episodes. They're doing several things at once, but all of this was, in a way, warm-up for what happened in 1999. before Season 3 even aired, while the show was still only 2 series old, Parker and Stone made a film. South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut premiered on June 23, 1999, with a wide U.S. release a week later. It was produced by Paramount Pictures and Warner Brothers stars, had a budget of $21 million, and took somewhere over $83 million at the worldwide box office. For an animated film based on a cable television program, that is an extraordinary result. But the money is almost the least interesting thing about the film. What Parker and Stone did with the feature was make an animated musical. A proper one, with original songs, musical sequences, a 3-act narrative structure, and genuine cinematic ambition. The film is, beneath all the profanity and crude humor, a satire of moral panic and censorship. Specifically, the kind of hysteria that parents generate when they decide that a piece of entertainment is corrupting their children. The film makes its argument both through the plot, which involves a war between the US and Canada triggered by outraged mothers, and through its form, because the film itself is the exact kind of entertainment that the parents in the story are trying to ban. The song Blame Canada was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Song in 2000. Let that settle for a moment. A song from a South Park film performed at the Oscars, with Robin Williams leading the audience in a sing-along. The song didn't win. You'll Be in My Heart from Tarzan took the award, but the nomination alone was a signal that the film had crossed over from the world of cable comedy into something the industry took seriously as a creative work. The film also entered the 2001 Guinness Book of World Records for the most profanity ever used in an animated film, which is a record it probably still holds. So it's doing both things simultaneously, genuine craft and gleeful vulgarity. That's South Park in concentrated form. The film came out in the summer between Series 2 and Series 3. It was a statement of intent. Parker and Stone were not interested in being defined by shock value alone. They were interested in using the shock as a delivery mechanism for something more pointed. The film proved they could do that at feature length with original music on a cinema screen. And then they went back to making a television series. Fan communities and television critics tend to agree on a rough definition of the golden era of South Park. Seasons 5 through 11 or so, covering roughly 2001 to 2007. Within that stretch, the show produced what most people consider its best work. The episodes that are still referenced, still quoted, still used as the benchmark against which everything else gets measured. I want to be clear that golden era is always a slightly slippery term. It tends to mean the period a particular person discovered the show, or the period that was most consistent, or the period that produced the most episodes that mattered to the specific person doing the ranking. There's truth in all of those definitions. But the seasons 5 through 11 consensus is real. And it's not just nostalgia. The episodes from those years hold up. They hold up because the writing got sharper, the targets got more interesting, and the show developed a confidence in its own voice that it hadn't quite had in those first few seasons. Season 5 is where everything sharpened, and it's where we get to the single most important episode in the show's history, at least in terms of defining what the program was capable of doing with its characters. Scott Tenorman Must Die is the 4th episode of Season 5, and it has a 9.6 out of 10 rating on IMDb, making it the highest rated episode in the show's entire 28-season run. That number alone should tell you something. But the rating doesn't really capture what the episode does. The setup is relatively simple. Scott Tenorman is an older boy who has humiliated Cartman and taken his money in a scheme involving pubic hair. Cartman, who does not forgive and absolutely does not forget, spends the episode plotting his revenge. What the episode does in its final few minutes is reveal what Cartman has actually been doing while everyone thought he was making relatively minor threats. I won't go into full detail for anyone who hasn't seen it, but the reveal involves Scott Tenorman's parents, a chili cook-off, and a scheme so calculated and so cold that it permanently changed how the audience understood Cartman as a character. The show itself telegraphed this. Cartman laughs at the end of the episode in a way that the voice performance makes genuinely unsettling. It's not the laugh of a kid getting the better of a bully, it's something else. Radiohead appear in the episode voiced by themselves, and their reaction to what Cartman has done is the closest the show comes to acknowledging the gravity of it. After Scott Tenorman must die, Cartman was no longer just the fat, selfish bully from season 1. He was something more disturbing than that, and the show never walked it back. We'll spend a proper section on what that eventually added up to. Season 5 was also notable for being the season Kenny died. Not in the usual way, not the running gag death that gets reversed next episode, but an actual narrative death. In the episode Kenny Dies, Kenny is diagnosed with a terminal illness, and the episode plays it mostly straight. It's not without comedy, but it has genuine feeling in it. Kenny's deterioration is treated with more care than you'd expect. His death at the end of the episode is not played for laughs. Kenny was then written out of most of season 6, replaced temporarily by Butters, and then by a character called Tweak, and returned at the end of season 6 in a way the show characteristically refused to explain. For a couple of years, the running death gag was suspended. The show seemed genuinely unsure what to do with the character once they'd taken him seriously for a moment. What they eventually did with him is one of the best things in the show's history, and that's for the Kenny section later. The middle seasons of the Golden Era, 6 through 8 or so, are interesting because they show the show expanding its targets. The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, Amansam from season 6, is the third highest rated episode on IMDb, 9.4, and it's a children's adventure story crossed with a parody of fantasy epics that's also genuinely about the way children process adult content that finds its way into their hands. It's a very well-constructed episode. The craft is evident. Season 8's Good Times with Weapons animated large sections in a stylized Japanese anime format. And Woodland Critter Christmas in the same season is a Christmas special structured as a fairy tale with a satanic twist that functions both as a parody of the Christmas special format and as a meta-commentary on narrative expectations in storytelling. These are not dumb episodes, these are episodes made by people who think carefully about structure. Then there's Season 10. Season 10 gave us 2 of the most significant episodes in the show's run. Cartoon Wars, episodes 3 and 4, was a 2-parter about Family Guy, censorship, and the depiction of Muhammad in media, which we'll discuss properly when we get to the controversy section because it has its own complicated history. And Make Love Not Warcraft, episode 8, was something genuinely new for television. Make Love Not Warcraft follows the boys as they try to stop a rogue player who is murdering everyone in World of Warcraft. The episode was produced in collaboration with Blizzard Entertainment and filmed extensively using the machinima technique, capturing footage inside the actual World of Warcraft game engine. The result is an episode that exists in 2 visual registers simultaneously: the cutout animation of South Park and the rendered 3D world of World of Warcraft, cross-cutting between them with complete confidence. It won the Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program in 2007. It's a 9.5 on IMDb. It's funny and it's sharp, and it understood something about gaming culture that almost nobody else in mainstream media was capturing at the time. Season 11 gave us the Imagination Land trilogy, 3 episodes built around a fully realized fantasy world populated by every fictional character ever imagined by humanity. It was ambitious, massively ambitious, and it worked. The 3 episodes were later edited into Imagination Land the Movie for a direct-to-video release, which won the Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program, long form, in 2008. 2 Emmys in a row. The show at that point was operating at a level of creative confidence that made everything feel possible. What I keep coming back to when I think about the Golden Era is the consistency. It's not that every episode was perfect, they weren't. Even in the best seasons, there are misses. but the hit rate was extraordinary. Over 7 or 8 seasons, the show produced dozens of episodes that stand up as genuinely good television by any standard, not just for an animated comedy, not just for a cable program, but by any standard. That's rare. That's the kind of run that most shows never achieve. At some point in the golden era, and this point is difficult to date precisely because it evolved rather than appeared suddenly, the South Park production team settled into a workflow that has no meaningful parallel in the history of American animated television. They make each episode in approximately 6 days. That sentence deserves to sit there for a moment because the context makes it remarkable. A standard episode of an animated television series in the United States can take somewhere between 8 and 9 months to produce. The animation has to be storyboarded, drawn, colored, composed, voiced, and put together in a process that is genuinely slow because each step takes time, and most of those steps can't be rushed without visibly degrading the quality. 8 to 9 months is the industry standard, and that standard exists because it's genuinely the minimum workable time frame for doing the job properly. South Park does it in 6 days. The cycle begins on a Thursday morning when Parker and Stone sit down with their writing team to brainstorm concepts. This is not always an easy process. Parker has described some Thursday morning as paralyzing, as the team sitting in a room with no idea what the episode is going to be, with the clock already ticking. Once a concept is chosen, Parker drafts the script. Not an outline, not a treatment, the actual script. The thing that will be recorded and animated and transmitted to Comedy Central by the following Wednesday evening. Around 70 people work on each episode during those 6 days: the animators, the editors, the sound engineers, the production staff. Parker and Stone have said they typically work something in the range of 100 to 120-hour weeks during production. The episode gets assembled in roughly real time, scenes are animated as the script pages come in, audio is recorded and cut and dropped into sequences that are simultaneously being built around them. The whole operation runs like a very controlled, very expensive emergency. I find this genuinely difficult to get my head around, if I'm being honest. I have enough trouble finishing a long email on a deadline. These two men are writing, directing, and producing a complete episode of television with animation, with music, with voice recording, with editing every single week for most of the year, and have been doing it since the late 1990s. The scale of that output is extraordinary even before you consider whether the episodes are any good. The fact that a significant portion of them are actually good is the part that keeps surprising me. The episode is transmitted to Comedy Central on the Wednesday, sometimes, according to Parker and Stone, arriving only hours before the 10 p.m. broadcast. The reason this matters, beyond being genuinely extraordinary as a logistical feat, is what it makes possible. South Park can comment on something that happened this week, not this month, not this season, this week. An episode can begin development on a Thursday following a Monday news event and air the following Wednesday. No other animated show has that capacity. No other animated show has ever had that capacity. It's the difference between commentary and archival. Some of the show's most effective episodes are effective precisely because they're responsive. The 2001 episode Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants, which aired in November of that year, less than 2 months after the September 11th attacks, is one example. The speed allowed the show to address something that was still raw, still being processed by the country, in a way that longer lead shows simply couldn't. Whether you think the episode handles the subject well is a separate question. The point is that the turnaround made it possible. There's a documentary called 6 Days to Air: The Making of South Park, which premiered on Comedy Central in October 2011. It follows Parker and Stone and the team through the production of the season 15 premiere, and it's worth watching if you're at all interested in the mechanics of television making. It captures something specific about the atmosphere of that studio during production week. The particular combination of creative excitement and logistical dread that comes from knowing you have to deliver a finished piece of television in a day or two. Parker has described the process as something he both loves and finds genuinely frightening every single time. There's no safety net, there's no episode bank from last month that can go out instead if this one falls apart. Every episode is a live event in a way that television almost never is. And that live event quality, that sense of something being made in real time for the world as it currently is something that comes through in the finished work even when you don't know that's how it was produced. A small aside, in 2025, during the production of season 27, the team missed a deadline. They issued a public apology, which read something like, "Apparently, when you do everything at the last minute, sometimes you don't get it done," which is the most South Park public apology imaginable. The episode aired a week late. The show recovered. Parker and Stone continue to be the only people running a major American animated series who write and direct essentially every episode themselves. South Park has generated more genuine controversy than almost any other television program in history. Some of it was trivial, the kind of outrage that functions as free publicity and fades within a news cycle. But some of it was not trivial at all. Some of it resulted in episodes being removed from streaming. Some of it resulted in actual threats to real people. And some of it led to one of the stranger celebrity departures in television history. Let's go through the ones that actually mattered. The Muhammad episodes are the most important and the most complicated, and I want to lay out the full arc because it unfolded over many years, and a lot of the individual pieces get misunderstood when they're separated from the whole. The Muhammad episode storyline started surprisingly quietly in season 5. The episode Super Best Friends features Muhammad alongside other religious figures, Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Krishna, Joseph Smith, as a team of superhero-like characters who help South Park deal with a cult. Muhammad appears in the episode without any particular controversy. He's there, he's drawn, he speaks, nobody makes a significant fuss about it. The episode aired in 2001 and for the most part was treated as just another South Park episode. What changed was the 2005-2006 controversy in Denmark, when a series of newspaper cartoons depicting Muhammad sparked protests and violence across the Muslim world. The broader cultural conversation about representations of Muhammad in Western media became genuinely tense in a way it hadn't been before. South Park, being South Park, decided to address this directly. In season 10, 2006, came Cartoon Wars, a two-part episode that addressed the Muhammad cartoon controversy through a satirical lens involving Family Guy. The premise was that Family Guy was going to show an image of Muhammad in an episode, and the question was whether they should. Comedy Central ultimately chose to censor the image of Muhammad in the episode itself. This created a situation where South Park was satirizing censorship while simultaneously being censored. Parker and Stone were publicly frustrated by this. The bigger moment arrived a few years later. In 2010, seasons 14, episodes 5 and 6, 200 and 201 arrived. These episodes were, among other things, the show's 200th and 201st episodes, and Parker and Stone used them to revisit virtually every controversy the show had ever generated. Multiple celebrity figures the show had mocked appeared in the episodes demanding apologies. And Muhammad appeared again, this time as the central figure in a plot that the show used to directly address the question of what it meant that the show could depict Jesus freely but not Muhammad. Before 201 aired, a radical organization posted what was widely interpreted as a threat against Parker and Stone, including their home addresses. Comedy Central's response was to heavily censor 201, bleeping the word Muhammad throughout and inserting black bars over visual representations. They also chose not to rerun 201. Both episodes were subsequently removed from the official streaming platforms and from syndication. 200 was also pulled. Super Best Friends, the original 2001 episode, was retroactively removed as well. Cartoon Wars, parts 1 and 2 were removed from the streaming bundle. As of today, those 5 episodes are not available on any major streaming platform. The show has 338 episodes at last count, and 5 of them, all connected to this specific controversy, simply don't appear in the catalog. They're not officially banned in the way that some episodes are banned in specific countries. They're just absent, not there. The gap in the catalog is itself a kind of document. Parker and Stone released a statement about Comedy Central's handling of 201, in which they said they were frustrated and that they'd said what they had to say and that it was pretty clear what was happening. They didn't elaborate much further. They kept making the show. The Isaac Hayes situation is different in nature and worth telling carefully. Hayes had been the voice of Chef, the school cafeteria worker, since season 1. He'd been a genuinely beloved part of the show. The songs Chef sang, the advice he gave the boys, his warmth and his charm were real contributions to the texture of the program. Hayes was also a Scientologist. In season 9, 2005, South Park aired an episode called Trapped in the Closet, which is a direct and fairly merciless parody of Scientology. The episode depicts Scientology's beliefs and practices, including specific elements of what practitioners learn at higher levels of the organization, in a way that the show's usual targets had long complained about, but which felt particularly pointed here. The episode concludes with a scroll of credits in which every name reads John Smith or Jane Smith, the implication being that Parker and Stone were protecting themselves from potential legal action. Hayes initially said nothing publicly. He stayed on the show. He voiced Chef in season 9 and beyond. But in early 2006, he gave an interview in which he criticized the show's religious intolerance and said he was leaving. He did not mention Scientology explicitly in that interview. Parker and Stone responded publicly by noting that Hayes had been fine with the show satirizing every other religion for 9 years, and that it was specifically the Scientology episode that had prompted his departure. They were fairly direct about this. There have since been claims from people who knew Hayes that his decision to leave was not entirely his own, that Hayes suffered a serious stroke in January 2006 and may not have been fully in control of what was being said publicly on his behalf. Those claims have never been fully resolved. What is documented is that Hayes' departure happened and that the show handled it by killing Chef. In the season 10 premiere, The Return of Chef, Chef is killed in a spectacularly violent sequence. He falls into a river, is mauled by a puma, catches fire, and is torn apart. The dialogue was assembled by editing together recordings from previous episodes, so Hayes' voice is present, but the content is being constructed rather than performed. Parker and Stone were clear that this was their response to what they viewed as a betrayal. The episode is dark even by South Park standards. The way it uses existing recordings is technically impressive and tonally unsettling. Chef was not replaced. His absence was simply written into the show. The China ban is the third major controversy worth just understanding in full. In 2019, season 23 included an episode called Banned in China, which satirized Hollywood's tendency to self-censor for the Chinese market. The episode depicted the Chinese government unfavorably and included a caricature of Winnie the Pooh, a specific reference to the widely circulated comparison of Xi Jinping to the character, which had been banned in China. The Chinese government's response was total. South Park was scrubbed from Chinese platforms. Episodes, clips, fan discussions, search results, all of it removed from Baidu, Bilibili, Sina Weibo, WeChat, and other major Chinese platforms. The entire franchise was effectively banned. Parker and Stone issued a response that read, roughly, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese government and its citizens to enjoy our cultural exports. Also, like the NBA, we do not care about losing their money. South Park has now been removed from the internet in China. Congratulations to them. And to Xi Jinping, happy 20th anniversary, Winnie the Pooh." The statement is a joke, but a very deliberate one. The show did not try to apologize or negotiate. It leaned in. The ban stands, South Park is still not available in China in any official capacity. There are other controversies worth at least a brief mention. It Hits the Fan in Season 5 featured 162 uncensored uses of a specific profanity in a single episode. The show was making a point about the arbitrary nature of broadcast standards, and it made the point rather comprehensively. Bloody Mary in Season 9 caused the Catholic League to lobby for the episode's permanent removal. The Steve Irwin Halloween costume episode in Season 10 prompted complaints from Irwin's widow. The Australian broadcaster SBS removed South Park from its catalog in 2020. India banned the show outright in 2010 due to vulgarity, and it wasn't available there until Netflix acquired streaming rights in 2019. The through line in all of this is that Parker and Stone have never in nearly 3 decades retreated from something they committed to purely because someone was unhappy, they've been censored, they've had episodes removed, they've lost revenue, they've been threatened, and they've kept going. Whether you find that admirable or reckless probably depends on which episode is being discussed. But as a creative stance, it's been extraordinarily consistent. Let me tell you about Kenny McCormick properly now. Because I mentioned him earlier in the character section, and I mentioned that his running death was a gag, and both of those things are true. But neither of them captures what actually happened with Kenny over the course of the show, and what happened is one of the most interesting things South Park ever did. Start from the beginning. In the first several seasons, Kenny's defining characteristic was that he died. Every episode, or nearly every episode, he'd get hit by a bus, he'd spontaneously combust. He'd be struck by lightning, or mauled by something, or crushed by a falling object. The deaths were creative and varied, and almost always played entirely for comedy. Stan would say the line, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny." Kyle would respond, "You bastards." And that was that. Next week, Kenny would be there again, alive and present, with nobody referencing what had happened, including Kenny. For the first 4 seasons or so, this was treated as exactly what it appeared to be, a running gag. The show never explained it, and nobody in the show questioned it. It was simply part of the furniture of the series. Kenny dies. That's his thing. I don't think I'm alone in having watched those early seasons and just accepted it as a joke without ever thinking to ask why. The show wasn't inviting you to ask why. It was presenting you with the gag and trusting you to find it funny, which most people did. Then, in Season 5, as I mentioned, the show did something unexpected. Kenny got sick. Actually sick. Not gag-dead sick, but terminally ill. And the episode, Kenny Dies, played his deterioration and eventual death with genuine feeling. His friends were sad. His absence was treated as real. And then he was written out of the show for most of Season 6, replaced by other characters in the group dynamics. He came back at the end of Season 6, alive and unexplained, and the show more or less moved on. For a while, it seemed like the running death gag had been retired without ceremony, and that Kenny was just going to be a regular character going forward. And then Season 14 happened, and the Coon trilogy. The Coon and Friends storyline across Season 14 involves the boys forming a superhero team. Various boys take on superhero identities, and Kenny's superhero identity is Mysterion. Mysterion is interesting immediately, because unlike the other boys in their superhero costumes who are clearly just playing pretend, Kenny as Mysterion seems to take his superhero identity in absolute earnest. There's a particular gravity to him in these episodes. He moves differently, he speaks differently, and at a certain point in the storyline, he tells his friends in the costume, as Mysterion standing in front of them, that he cannot die. He doesn't say this as a joke. He doesn't say it with a wink. He explains it plainly. He has been killed multiple times. He always comes back. Nobody ever remembers that it happened. His friends don't believe him. They think he's exaggerating or confused or doing a bit. So Kenny, standing there in his Mysterion costume, pulls out a gun and shoots himself in the head. The other boys are horrified. They're crying, they're panicking, they have no idea how to process what they've just seen. And then the next morning, Kenny wakes up in his bed, alive and entirely uninjured. He goes to school, he sees his friends, and not one of them remembers what happened the night before. I want to spend a moment on what the show is doing there because it's quite extraordinary given the context. Here's a character who has been dying as a punchline for over a decade of television, and the show has now revealed that the punchline is also a genuine tragedy. Kenny is trapped in an eternal cycle of death and resurrection. He knows it's happening, he experiences every death, and then he comes back and nobody knows. Nobody ever knows. He is completely alone in the knowledge of his own condition. The emotional weight of that, once you feel it, is hard to shake. The show goes further. It explains, within the Coon trilogy, where Kenny's curse comes from. Kenny confronts his parents. His parents admit that they attended meetings for something called the Cult of Cthulhu, the Lovecraftian cosmic entity. Yes, years ago. And the reason they joined? Free beer. That's the canonical answer. Kenny's parents condemned their son to an eternity of dying and being reborn because they wanted free beer. The Cult of Cthulhu was offering it, and they thought, sure, why not? If that isn't the most South Park explanation for cosmic horror that exists, I'm not sure what would top it. There's a moment near the end of the Coon trilogy that might be the most haunting thing the show has ever produced. Kenny has died again. He's been reborn again. Nobody remembers again. And Kenny, exhausted, tells his friends he's tired and wants to go home to sleep. He goes home. He shoots himself in the head. His friends are horrified all over again. They'll forget by morning. They always do. The camera cuts to Kenny's mother, asleep, jolting awake and clutching her stomach. She cries out in pain. She gives birth. She places the baby in a tiny orange parka in a crib. She turns to her husband, and she says, with something close to genuine regret, "We never should have gone to that stupid cult meeting." That single line changes every Kenny death that came before it. Every gag death in every early episode is now retroactively a tragedy nobody was paying attention to. Every time Stan said, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," and Kyle said, "You bastards," and they both moved on without thinking about it, that's now what it looks like when someone dies alone and nobody remembers. I'll be honest, I think that recontextualization is one of the genuinely brilliant things South Park ever did. It's the kind of long game that requires either extraordinary planning or extraordinary luck, and whether it was deliberately seeded from the first series or arrived naturally through accumulated seasons of writing, the effect is the same. The joke was always hiding something darker underneath. There's one more layer to the Kenny mythology worth mentioning, though it lives in the space between confirmed fact and fan theory, rather than in clearly established canon. At some point during the show's run, Cartman received a corneal transplant. The eye that was used in the show gestures at this without being completely explicit may have come from Kenny. There are episodes where Cartman seems to have brief moments of awareness about Kenny's situation, fleeting insights that don't match with everything else we know about Cartman's complete self-absorption. The eye transplant theory suggests that receiving part of Kenny gave Cartman a partial, occasional connection to Kenny's perspective. Not full knowledge, not reliable awareness, just flickers. Is this confirmed? No. Has it ever been explicitly denied? Also no. It's one of those theories that the show seems to have deliberately left ambiguous, which is itself an answer of a kind. What gets me most about all of this when I sit with it is how the show handled Kenny's deaths over time after the revelation. In the early seasons, they were constant. In later seasons, they became rarer. And when Kenny does die in later episodes, it lands differently, heavier, more considered. Once you know the mythology, once you've seen the scene with his mother placing the baby in the crib, you can't watch a Kenny death as a joke anymore. The joke has been inhabited by something too real. In a weird way, Kenny might be the most tragic figure in South Park. Not because the worst things happen to him. Plenty of characters go through terrible things in this show, but because he goes through terrible things completely alone, over and over, with no possibility of sharing it or being understood or having someone remember. The dying isn't the tragedy. The forgetting is. We need to talk about Cartman properly now. Not just as a comic character, though he is consistently one of the funniest characters in television, but as a creative achievement. Because what the show has done with Eric Cartman over 28 seasons is genuinely unusual in the context of animated television. It's arguably unusual in the context of television full stop. He started as a type, a fat, selfish, loud, bullying child. The kind of kid who doesn't share, who complains constantly, who manipulates adults into giving him things, who believes firmly that the world exists to serve him and becomes genuinely angry when it fails to do so. That type is funny. It's a reliable comic engine. Parker understood from the beginning that there was something inherently absurd about a 9-year-old child with the moral framework of a Bond villain. But Scott Tenorman Must Die changed what Cartman was, changed it permanently. The episode, which we touched on in the Golden Era section, ends with a reveal that shows what Cartman has been doing behind the scenes, a scheme so elaborately planned, so completely devoid of empathy, and so perfectly executed that the show itself pauses for a moment to acknowledge what it's just shown the audience. The laugh that closes that episode is not the laugh of a child getting the better of someone who wronged him. It's the laugh of someone who genuinely enjoyed what they did, who found it beautiful, who is not, in any meaningful way, sorry. After that episode, the theory that Cartman is a sociopath, a genuine one, not a hyperbole, became essentially unavoidable for anyone paying close attention. The show has never labeled him explicitly. Parker has never given an interview saying, yes, Cartman is a sociopath. The show is too careful for that and too committed to the comedy of the character to want to reduce him to a clinical diagnosis. But the evidence, if you compile it across the seasons, is substantial. Cartman doesn't experience empathy in any consistent or reliable way. He understands other people's feelings well enough to manipulate them. He's extremely skilled at identifying what someone cares about and using it against them, but he doesn't share those feelings. He has no genuine remorse. He has no meaningful relationships built on anything other than utility. His friendship with Kyle is, at its core, an extended performance of friendship in which Cartman does what he wants and Kyle reacts. Kyle's reaction is what Cartman seems to find most satisfying about the dynamic. His long-term planning is genuinely chilling when laid out plainly. The Tenorman scheme is the most famous example, but there are others across the seasons. Episodes in which Cartman engineers elaborate situations to humiliate or harm someone who has crossed him, situations that require weeks or months of patient groundwork and a complete absence of anything that would normally be called a conscience. And then there's how he treats Butters. Butters is, as we've discussed, the most innocent character on the show. He trusts people. He takes what he's told at face value. He doesn't have defenses. And Cartman has used Butters across dozens of episodes as a tool, a vehicle, a resource to be deployed and discarded. Not because Cartman hates Butters, there's no evidence of active hatred, but because Butters is useful and because Cartman simply doesn't think about other people in terms of their inner lives. They're pieces on a board. What makes this creatively interesting rather than just grim is that the show never stops being funny about it. The comedy doesn't disappear when Cartman does something genuinely dark. If anything, the comedy intensifies because there's something about the scale of the transgression combined with the specificity of Cartman's self-justification that creates a very particular kind of humor. He always has a reason. The reason is always self-serving and slightly absurd and completely sincere. He's never cynical about his own motivations. He genuinely believes he's the wrong party in almost every situation. Parker has talked about Cartman being the most fun character to write because he has no limits. Other characters in the show have things they wouldn't do, lines they wouldn't cross, values they'd protect even in extremis. Cartman does have limits and values he would protect. Any episode can go anywhere if Cartman is the engine driving it. What Cartman represents in the show's larger satirical framework is worth thinking about. He's not just a character study, he's a portrait of a specific kind of American entitlement. The entitled self-righteousness that convinces itself it deserves everything it wants, that frames every act of selfishness as a reasonable response to persecution, that can find a moral justification for anything. The show has never quite said this explicitly. It doesn't need to. The character does the work. There's a moment in the episode Cartman Sucks, where a brief visual suggests, via a photograph that shouldn't exist, that Cartman may have done something to Butters while Butters was asleep. The show gestures at this and then moves on without confirming or explaining it. The gesture is enough to be disturbing, and the fact that the show includes it and moves on without dwelling on it is itself a kind of disturbing, the comfortable acceptance of what this character might be capable of. I've watched a lot of television. I find it hard to think of another example of a character who functions as a primary comic engine, while simultaneously being, at an honestly assessed level, something close to a monster. Cartman is funny. He's also, if you take him seriously, quite frightening. The show has kept both of those things true for almost 30 years. That's not easy. That's not an accident. If you had to name the single biggest change in South Park's format over its run, it wouldn't be the animation style changing, or the episode order fluctuating, or even the creative team evolving. It would be the shift, beginning around season 18 towards serialized storytelling. South Park had always been an episodic show in the classic television sense. Each episode told a complete story. The continuity between episodes was loose at best. Characters died and came back. Events happened and were forgotten. The town reset to approximately its starting position by the end of every 22 minutes. This wasn't a flaw. It was structurally intentional. The floating, timeless quality of the show was part of its freedom. If every episode was self-contained, every episode could go anywhere. What changed from season 18 onward was a gradual experiment with carrying storylines across episodes, letting consequences accumulate, building arcs that rewarded watching in sequence. The show hadn't done this in any sustained way before. The Coon trilogy and the Imagination Land trilogy had been multi-part events, but they were clearly special exceptions rather than a new template. Season 18 began testing the waters. Season 19 went further. Season 19 introduced PC Principal, a massive, aggressive, humorless campus police figure who arrives at the school and begins enforcing a regime of political correctness with the subtlety of a rugby tackle. PC Principal was designed as an antagonist, and the first few episodes played him purely that way. But as the season developed, and as the show began to take him more seriously as a character rather than just a target, something unexpected happened. He became more interesting than anticipated, and the show started finding genuine things to say about the kind of institutional, performative progressivism he represented. He stuck around, he's still in the show, he became a main character. Season 19 also had a sustained storyline about gentrification, specifically the transformation of South Park by the arrival of high-end chain restaurants and artisanal coffee shops, which seemed to make the town better on the surface but hollowed out something essential in the process. It's not the most subtle metaphor the show has ever deployed, but it works. Then there was season 20. Season 20 is the most heavily serialized season the show has ever produced. A single, continuous 10-episode arc covering an internet troll storyline, a 2016 presidential election parody, with Mr. Garrison as a Donald Trump analog, and various threads that wound through all 10 episodes and required watching in order to make sense. It was ambitious. It was also, for a significant portion of the audience, exhausting. The problem with serialization for South Park is that the show's greatest strength, its responsiveness, its ability to drop into a topic and extract its satirical essence in 22 minutes, is somewhat impeded by the obligation to maintain continuity. If you've set up a thread in episode 3 that needs to pay off in episode 8, You can't just abandon it when something more interesting happens in the news in weeks 4 through 7. The format that makes South Park great works against the sustained narrative arc. Season 20's reception reflected this. Parts of it were sharp, parts of it felt like the show was trapped by its own structure. The member berries, mysterious small fruits that prompted nostalgia with phrases like "member when Chewbacca was in Star Wars," were a genuine comedic and satirical invention, and we'll spend time with them in the theory section because they reward close reading. But the overall arc of Season 20 didn't quite land in the way the ambition behind it suggested it might. The show pulled back from strict serialization in subsequent seasons. What developed instead was something more flexible, loose seasonal themes and character arcs that didn't require watching in order but rewarded it. Randy's Tigridy Farm storyline, his marijuana business, which dominated seasons 22 and 23, was a long-running arc in this more comfortable hybrid mode. You could watch any individual episode and understand what was happening, but the full picture of Randy's escalating self-delusion and self-justification was richer if you followed it across multiple episodes. The Season 20 experiment was valuable even if it didn't fully succeed, because it forced the show to think carefully about what serialization does and doesn't suit it. The seasons that followed were better for having gone through that process. The show emerged with a clearer sense of where the line was between useful continuity and structural constraint. Here's something that I think is genuinely fascinating about South Park. The show's main character isn't who you'd expect, and the show probably didn't plan it that way. Randy Marsh started as Stan's dad, a supporting character, present in Season 1 for exactly as long as the plot required a parent and not a moment longer. He was fine, affable, slightly bumbling, exactly what he needed to be, which was background furniture that the main characters could interact with when the story needed an adult in the room. Over the first several seasons, Randy started appearing more. His appearances got longer. His subplots began to edge toward parody with the boys' plots. Writers seemed to discover that Randy was a productive comic engine, that there was something inexhaustible about a middle-aged man who perpetually overestimates himself, perpetually misjudges situations, perpetually turns every event in the world into an opportunity to make himself the protagonist. By the middle seasons, Randy was a recurring comedy standout. His performance at the Wheel of Fortune in Season 11, where he shouts a racial slur on national television under circumstances that the show constructs to make it feel almost unavoidable, is one of the most replayed moments in the show's history. His career as a geologist who becomes convinced he can create a sarcastiball craze in Season 16. His transformation into Lord, the New Zealand pop star, in Season 18. Randy as a character keeps generating these extraordinary specific moments because the writers found in him a vehicle for a very particular kind of human foolishness. The well-meaning, fundamentally decent, nevertheless catastrophically self-absorbed foolishness of a certain kind of baby boomer man. And then came Tigridy Farms. Starting in Season 22, Randy buys a marijuana farm and moves his family to the country. The farm is called Tigridy Farms, and the word Tegrity is Randy's way of saying integrity, a running joke about the gap between what Randy believes he represents, authentic, principled, independent, and what he actually represents, a businessman who will do anything to sell more product. The Tigridy Farms arc became the dominant, ongoing storyline of the show for several seasons. Whole episodes centered on Randy growing weed, packaging it, marketing it, protecting his market share from competitors, and making increasingly questionable ethical decisions while insisting he's just a simple farmer with values. The satire in the Tigridy Farms material is aimed squarely at a specific generational phenomenon. The boomer who got very excited about marijuana legalization not because they'd ever had progressive drug views, but because they could now feel like a countercultural rebel while making money and following the rules. The Tigridy joke lands differently depending on how much exposure you've had to that specific flavor of self-congratulatory capitalism. but it's a precise observation once you see what it's pointing at. Parker has been fairly open about Randy being autobiographical in a self-critical way. Randy's worst qualities, the self-delusion, the tendency to make things about himself, the belief that whatever he's currently excited about represents his authentic identity, are qualities Parker seems to recognize in himself, or at least in his generation. There's a kind of affectionate contempt in how the show treats Randy, which is a slightly unusual authorial relationship to your own character. By season 22 and 23, critics and fans were noting something that had become hard to deny. Randy Marsh was, in practice, the show's main character. The boys were still there. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, Kenny, Butters. They still had their stories, their dynamics, their moments. But the sustained narrative gravity of the show had shifted toward Randy. When you asked what South Park was about right now, in those seasons, the honest answer was often Randy's marijuana farm. Some fans loved this. They found Randy's arc more interesting than the boys' episodic adventures, and there's a case to be made for that. Randy as a character has a depth and a specificity that's accumulated over decades of slow development, and the Tegrity Farms material uses that accumulated depth in interesting ways. Other fans felt a genuine loss. The show they'd grown up with was about 4 boys dealing with an absurd world, and the gradual displacement of that premise by a middle-aged man's cannabis business felt like a change in fundamental terms. Both reactions make sense. Both are about the same thing, which is that South Park in its later seasons is a different show than South Park in its earlier seasons. Not worse, necessarily, different. The show has aged with its creators, which is either a sign of artistic maturity or a sign of drift, depending on your point of view and which era you prefer. What I'd offer is this: no show runs for 28 seasons without changing. The question isn't whether it changes, it always will, but whether the changes are honest. And the Randy Marsh evolution feels honest. It feels like writers following something they find genuinely interesting rather than servicing a formula. That's something. South Park generates fan theories at an unusual rate. Part of this is because the show is internally inconsistent, by design and by necessity. A program that produces a new episode every 6 days across 28 seasons and has never committed to any fixed continuity is going to leave enormous gaps, contradictions, and open questions. Into those gaps, fans pour interpretation. And some of those interpretations are genuinely interesting, genuinely revealing about what the show is doing beneath the surface. Let's go through the ones that have stayed with people. The first one is the floating timeline, which isn't really a theory so much as an observation, but it's an observation that opens some interesting doors once you follow it. The boys have been in the 4th grade since 2000. Stan Marsh was 9 years old in the first episode. Stan Marsh is 9 years old in season 28. Nearly 30 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in South Park, Colorado. The town doesn't age, the boys don't age, the adults don't visibly change. Episodes occasionally make gestures toward continuity. A character remembers something that happened in a previous episode. A running storyline carries threads forward, but these are exceptions rather than the rule. The fundamental premise is that the show exists in a kind of eternal present. Parker and Stone have never attempted to explain or justify this. Their consistent position is that South Park runs on no fixed continuity and that contradictions between episodes are simply the cost of doing business at the pace they work. The fan theory is that this isn't just a production convenience, it's intentional on a deeper level. South Park, Colorado exists outside of normal time. It's a town where the same 4 boys are perpetually 9 years old, where the same arguments recur endlessly, where the same cultural panics sweep through and are resolved and forgotten and replaced by the next one, where nothing ever fundamentally changes even though everything is always in upheaval. The theory suggests this is the show's actual thesis about small-town American life. Not that nothing interesting happens there, but that nothing ever changes there, that the loops just keep looping. It's hard to say whether that reading is true in the sense that Parker and Stone intended it. but it's worth noting that the show has, particularly in later seasons, leaned into the circularity. Characters get the same lessons and forget them. Randy commits the same category of self-deception and emerges confident it won't happen again. The boys make the same mistakes, the town rallies behind the same kind of cause, and then abandons it in the same way. The eternal present feels less like a production limitation and more like a statement, even if it started as the former. The second one I want to talk about is sometimes called the simulation or test ground theory, and I'll be upfront. This is the one I find hardest to fully dismiss. Think about what South Park, Colorado has actually been through. Across the series, the town experiences alien invasions, global catastrophes, visits from Satan in person, a portal to imagination land, zombie outbreaks, the physical presence of the Antichrist, and encounters with Cthulhu-adjacent cosmic entities. No real place experiences all of this. No real place comes close. A small mountain town in Colorado should be known for its ski season and may be a good diner, not for having hosted essentially every major supernatural event of the past 3 decades simultaneously. The theory is that the town is not a real place in any normal sense. It's a controlled environment, an experiment, a test, an observation post. Something is directing these events towards South Park on purpose. The town's response to each crisis becomes data for something operating at a scale the characters can't perceive. The theory becomes more interesting in light of seasons 19 and 20, where the show started gesturing toward this idea explicitly. The town as a microcosm being watched, where the broader culture's worst impulses arrive in concentrated form first. Whether that was deliberate or just the show doing what South Park always does, using a small setting to comment on big events, the overlap is hard to ignore. The third theory, and this one is specific to individual characters, is about what Cartman may have gained through the eye transplant. We touched on this in the Kenny section, but it's worth laying out the theory properly here. Cartman, at some point in the show, received an eye transplant. The donor eye was Kenny's. The show gestured at this without being explicit. In the episodes following the transplant, there are moments where Cartman displays a flash of awareness that doesn't quite fit his usual character, a moment of recognition about something he shouldn't know, a brief insight that then disappears. The theory suggests that the transplant gave Cartman an occasional, unreliable window into Kenny's perspective. Not full knowledge of Kenny's immortality, not consistent awareness, just flickers. Enough to explain those odd moments, and enough possibly to explain why Cartman is sometimes kinder to Kenny than to almost anyone else. If he's occasionally accessing something of Kenny's experience, even briefly, he might be the only character in the show with any genuine sense of what Kenny is going through. The show has left it deliberately ambiguous, and for a program that is almost never subtle about its own intentions, that silence is interesting in itself. The fourth theory is about the member berries, which appeared in season 20 and which I promised we'd come back to. In season 20, small purple berry-like creatures begin to appear. They speak. They say things like, "Member Chewbacca," "Member the Force," "Member Ghostbusters." Oh, I member. They make you feel warm and good and comfortable by triggering nostalgic memories of things you used to love. They're addictive. People begin consuming them compulsively. Politicians use them. The election in the season's narrative is at least partly driven by member berry sentiment. The surface reading is straightforward satire. The member berries are a metaphor for nostalgia as a political weapon, for the way "make things great again" rhetoric works by substituting warm feelings about the past for any actual engagement with the present. That reading is correct, and the show is fairly explicit about it. But the deeper theory goes further. The member berries aren't just a metaphor for one specific political movement. They're a metaphor for how collective cultural memory operates, how the things that made us feel good at a particular age become a kind of mental shortcut that bypasses critical thinking. Remember when everything was better? Is the member berries question, and the insidious thing about that question is that it doesn't require an answer. The feeling it produces doesn't need to be justified. Nostalgia is its own justification. You remember it, therefore it was good, therefore the present is lacking, therefore something must be done to restore what was lost. The theory extends this into the show's own relationship with its audience. South Park fans have been member-bearing about the golden era for decades. Member Bandcamp? Member Scott Tenorman? Remember when the show was brilliant? The show, by this reading, is using Season 20 to gently satirize its own audience's nostalgia, as much as it's satirizing broader political nostalgia. The member berries are pointing inward as much as outward. Parker and Stone haven't confirmed this reading, but it fits. The fifth theory is about PC Principle, and it's the most counterintuitive of the group. PC Principle was introduced in Season 19 as a villain. He's large, aggressive, humorless, and committed to enforcing progressive linguistic and behavioral norms with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. The show initially treats him as a target, the obvious satire of a certain kind of performative, institutional progressivism, the kind that's more interested in policing language than in actually improving anything. But here's the theory. By the standards of South Park's actual values, the things the show has consistently cared about across all 28 seasons, PC Principle is one of the more reliably decent characters in the cast. He's not corrupt, he's not self-serving, he doesn't abuse his position for personal gain, his methods are heavy-handed and often counterproductive. But his aims, if you look at them plainly, are usually something the show endorses at a deeper level. Treat people with basic dignity, don't punch down, protect kids who are being hurt. The theory suggests that the show has gradually been doing something quite sophisticated with PC Principle, introducing him as a satirical target and then quietly, over subsequent seasons, rehabilitating him into something closer to the show's actual moral position. Not making him right about everything, not endorsing his methods, but acknowledging that the thing he's trying to protect, basic human decency, is worth protecting, and that the satire of the performative version of progressivism shouldn't be mistaken for a rejection of progressive values altogether. Whether this was planned from the beginning or arrived through the natural process of writing the character across many seasons is impossible to know from outside the writer's room. But the trajectory is real. And then the sixth theory, which is the meta one, Parker and Stone as hidden characters. The show has multiple episodes where the creative process itself becomes a subject. Episodes about writing stories, about making decisions, about the responsibility that comes with being the person who gets to decide what the narrative does. In some of these episodes, the boys function as analogs for Parker and Stone, making creative decisions, bearing consequences for those decisions, negotiating with the world about what's allowable and what isn't. The theory is that the show, at some level, is always about the experience of making the show. That the boys' relationship with a world that's absurd and overwhelming and frequently hostile to reason is a portrait of Parker and Stone's relationship with the media landscape they've been operating in for 3 decades. That when Stan says something is stupid and everyone ignores him, that's Parker at a pitch meeting. That when Cartman gets his way through sheer force of personality and complete indifference to others, that's a satire of the entertainment industry's actual power structures. This reading doesn't require you to accept it wholesale. It works better as one layer among several than as the definitive interpretation. But once you're aware of it, certain episodes acquire an additional texture. Of all of these, if you're asking which one I find most genuinely compelling, the member berries theory is the one that stayed with me longest. Not because it's the most dramatic, but because it does the thing that the best South Park theories do, which is make you realize the show is pointing the camera at you as well as at the thing you thought it was pointing the camera at. The member berries as a metaphor for audience nostalgia is a bit uncomfortable to sit with if you've ever caught yourself saying, "Remember when South Park was really good?" Which, if you've been watching for a while, you probably have. At some point around 2020, I think a lot of people who've been watching South Park for a long time quietly assumed the show was winding down. It had been going for over 20 years. The episode orders had been shrinking from the early series 13 to 18 episodes down to 10 per season, then to 6, then in 2020 to 2. Season 24, that COVID year, was essentially just a pair of long specials rather than anything resembling a traditional season. The show was still existing, but it had the feel of something conserving its energy. Then in 2021, Comedy Central and Paramount announced a deal that surprised a lot of people. Parker and Stone signed a contract reportedly worth $900 million covering renewal through season 30 plus 14 original specials exclusive to the streaming service Paramount+. The deal was one of the largest ever signed for an animated television program. It committed South Park to a production slate running through to at least 2027. And it introduced a new element to the show's delivery, the Paramount Plus specials, which were longer form films, typically around 45 minutes, that could do things structurally that a regular 22-minute episode couldn't. The specials have been a mixed but interesting addition. Post-COVID and the return of COVID in 2021 depicted a future version of South Park where the boys are adults, trying to fix a world that got badly broken. They're the closest the show has come to committing to a narrative that actually acknowledges the boys growing up, even if it's in a speculative future set context. South Park joining the Pandaverse in 2023 was a Strange Doctor-style parallel universe story that used the multiversal format to satirize Hollywood's diversity hiring practices. The End of Obesity in 2024 was about GLP-1 weight loss drugs and their social implications. Not all of the specials worked equally well, and the extended runtime sometimes exposed the difficulty of sustaining South Park's pacing beyond the 22-minute format it was built for. But they represented a genuine expansion of what the show was trying to do, and some of them landed very well. In July 2025, a further deal was announced. $1.5 billion, 50 new episodes guaranteed. The show committed through 2029 to 2030 at minimum. By any measure, South Park is not going anywhere. The most recent seasons, 27 and 28, both airing in 2025, returned the show to the kind of sustained, topical satire it had always been best at. Season 27 centered on a depiction of Donald Trump's second administration, with Trump as a character in an ongoing relationship with Satan. And Season 28 continued into territory involving Peter Thiel, a mysterious internet meme potentially representing the Antichrist, and Cartman's increasingly complicated relationship with Christianity. They're very much South Park episodes. The absurdity is calibrated. The satire has targets. The boys are still there, still 9 years old, still at the bus stop. Season 27's premiere, Sermon on the Mount, drew 5.9 million cross-platform viewers in its first 3 days. That's a 68% increase over the Season 26 premiere. It was the biggest Comedy Central premiere in terms of share since 1999, since the third season of the show. That number is remarkable. A program that's been on the air for 28 years generated its biggest premiere performance since 1999. As of December 2025, South Park has 338 episodes in the catalog. That makes it the fourth longest-running American animated series in history, and the second longest-running one aimed at adults, which you'd have gathered by now given everything we've covered. I find the award count more interesting than the episode count, honestly. 5 Emmys, a Peabody Award, an Academy Award nomination for Blame Canada, and in 2025, a Critics' Choice Television Award for Best Animated Series. That's a fairly remarkable haul for any show. For a show that began as a paper cutout short about a street fight between Jesus and Santa, it's a bit absurd in the best possible way. The merchandise revenue over the show's lifetime is genuinely staggering. The franchise has generated over $250 million in retail sales as of 2000. In the year 2000, franchise merchandise had already exceeded $250 million. The t-shirt sales alone in that first year were extraordinary, numbers nobody had expected from a late-night cable cartoon. Parker and Stone are still there. Trey still writes and directs essentially everything. They still use the 6-day production cycle. They're still, as far as anyone can tell, interested in what the show is doing and capable of finding things to say about the world. There's no obvious sign that either of them has run out of material or curiosity. Whether South Park can run forever is a question that probably doesn't have a clean answer. It can run as long as Parker and Stone want it to, and as long as the infrastructure keeps supporting it. The 2025 deal secures it to the end of the decade. What happens after that depends on what two men in their mid-50s still find worth saying, which is a question nobody can answer from outside. I want to spend a bit of time on something that doesn't always get discussed in the context of the show's legacy, partly because it's difficult to quantify and partly because it happened gradually and almost invisibly. South Park became a language, not in the way that all popular television becomes cultural shorthand, where you reference a famous scene or quote a catchphrase and people recognize it. Something more pervasive than that. South Park created a set of expressions and images and reactions that people absorbed so thoroughly they stopped being quotations and started being part of how people actually communicated. Respect my authority stopped being a Cartman line and became a way of describing a certain kind of petty, diluted power. You bastards became a stock response to any minor injustice, particularly online. Screw you guys, I'm going home became a template for exiting any argument you didn't want to finish. The specific rhythm of Cartman's self-justifications, the elaborate moral framework built around a completely indefensible position, became recognizable shorthand for a type of person that everyone knows. And then there are the images. South Park is one of the most heavily meme-sourced animated shows in history. The confused Mr. Krabs image from SpongeBob is more famous, perhaps, but South Park has its own equivalent moments that have achieved a kind of immortality on the internet. Eric Cartman pointing at a board and explaining a scheme. Stan saying, "Dude, this is pretty F-ed up right here." Mr. Garrison doing something awful. Randy Marsh looking confident about something he absolutely should not feel confident about. These images get repurposed endlessly because they capture emotional states with a precision that's hard to replicate in text alone. What's interesting about South Park's contribution to internet language specifically is that it tends to cluster around a particular category of feeling, the feeling of watching someone completely commit to a wrong position. The Cartman reaction face, the Stan looking disgusted face, the moment where someone in the show pauses, visibly processes that what they are witnessing is completely insane, and then carries on anyway. Those moments resonate because they describe something real about how people experience the modern world, the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from watching obviously bad ideas be executed with enormous confidence. The show's relationship with the internet has also been shaped by its streaming availability, which has been somewhat complicated. South Park Studios maintained a free streaming website that housed almost the entire catalog for years, which meant that episodes from season 1 were as accessible as episodes from last week. That accessibility made it very easy for the show to be discovered and rediscovered and clipped and shared in ways that kept older episodes in circulation long after they'd aired. The golden era episodes didn't feel like archive material because they were always right there. The 5 absent episodes, the Muhammad ones, have a strange presence online precisely because of their absence. The gaps in the catalog are visible and known, and the knowledge that these specific episodes exist but aren't accessible has made them objects of considerable interest and discussion. They're probably the most talked about episodes the show has that most people haven't seen, which is an unusual kind of cultural life for a television episode to have. There's a specific comedy vocabulary that South Park developed and then spread into the culture, and that vocabulary has something distinctive about it. It's the vocabulary of the unimpressed witness, the person who is watching something completely unhinged happen, and is choosing exhaustedly to describe it accurately rather than react to it. Stan's sighs, Kyle's exasperated moral stands, the show's narrator dryly explaining another catastrophe with complete documentary detachment. The show trained its audience to adopt this mode, to look at something absurd and respond with clarity rather than hysteria. Whether that's actually good for the culture is a separate question, and one the show itself has occasionally grappled with. There are episodes from the later seasons that seem genuinely worried about the nihilism that can come from unlimited ironic detachment. The episode You're Getting Old in season 15 is probably the most direct engagement the show has ever had with this. An episode where Stan suddenly finds everything literally sounds like crap, and nothing is able to cut through the gray flatness of ironic distance. Parker has said this episode came from a genuinely dark period in his own life, and whether that's true or not, the episode lands differently than almost anything else in the show's run. It feels unguarded. Let me come back to Chef for a moment because I don't think we quite did him justice earlier. Chef Jerome Muckleroy was the South Park Elementary School cafeteria cook. He was a tall, dignified, warm man with an extraordinary baritone voice who spoke to the children about their problems with the calm authority of someone who had genuinely seen the world and arrived at some peace with it. He also, on fairly regular occasions, burst into original soul songs about his feelings, or about whatever situation the episode required him to comment on. He called the children children in a way that sounded like actual affection. Isaac Hayes voiced Chef for 9 seasons, from 1997 to 2006. That's a significant tenure. Hayes was already a legend before South Park. Shaft, the Academy Award-winning score he wrote in 1971, had defined his career and his cultural footprint. But his contribution to South Park was genuinely its own thing. The warmth of Chef was real. The voice was extraordinary. And the contrast between Chef's soulful dignity and the chaos around him was one of the show's most reliable comic pleasures. Hayes was, as I mentioned in the controversy section, a Scientologist. And Trapped in the Closet, the season 9 episode satirizing Scientology, created a situation Hayes eventually found untenable. His departure was announced in early 2006. What I want to add here is a note about the human complexity of the situation, because it deserves more than a summary. Hayes was friends with Parker and Stone. He'd worked with them for 9 years. He'd been part of something significant. Whatever happened in those final months, and there are legitimate questions about how much of the public statement reflected Hayes' own views given his health at the time, the departure represented the end of a creative relationship that had been genuinely important to the show. The way the show handled it was characteristically South Park. The kill-off was violent, clearly pointed, and done with a kind of hurt aggression underneath the comedy. Parker and Stone were not neutral about what had happened. The episode where Chef dies is not a loving farewell. It's something more complicated than that, anger dressed up in satire, which is a thing South Park does very well and probably too easily at times. Hayes died in 2008, 2 years after leaving the show. His contributions to the program are real and not separable from what Chef was. That warmth in the voice wasn't a performance. You can feel it in every episode he appeared in. I want to spend a moment on the awards because they're interesting in what they reveal, and because the specific episodes that won tell you something about which eras the industry took seriously. The Emmys first. The specific episodes that claim them are worth knowing: Best Friends Forever in Season 9, Make Love, Not Warcraft in Season 10, The Imagination Land Special, Margaritaville in Season 13, and Raising the Bar in Season 17. That's a spread across several different eras. The recognition didn't cluster in the golden era alone, it came from multiple periods, which suggests the show maintained a higher baseline of quality than the narrative of "it got worse" after Season 12 sometimes implies. The Peabody Award, which came in 2005-2006, is arguably more meaningful as a critical recognition. The Peabody goes to work that demonstrates distinguished and meritorious public service. The phrase is a bit stiff, but what the award was recognizing was the show's satirical value. the way it engaged with real issues in real time with a directness that most media couldn't match. Getting a Peabody for South Park is a bit like getting a safety commendation for Formula One. The form usually doesn't invite those kinds of credentials. The fact that it happened says something. The Academy Award nomination for Blame Canada in 2000 is the piece of recognition that still makes me laugh a little when I think about it. The Oscar ceremony in March 2000, with Robin Williams leading the audience in a spirited performance of a song about blaming Canada. The song didn't win, but the fact of its nomination is its own small historical moment. Proof that a film built entirely around satirizing the idea of parental moral panic about a crude animated show had penetrated far enough into the cultural mainstream that the Academy was nominating it for its highest honor in songwriting. The show lost to You'll Be in My Heart from Tarzan, which is a fine song, but I think most people would agree the South Park nomination was more interesting. And then there's the 2025 Critics' Choice Television Award for Best Animated Series, which the show won at 28 seasons old, which is genuinely remarkable. Most shows at that age are either canceled or coasting. South Park winning a Contemporary Critics Award after nearly 3 decades is a signal that, whatever the debates about individual seasons, the show is still being taken seriously as a creative work. The merchandise numbers we mentioned earlier tell their own story about penetration, not just watched, but worn and displayed and collected. Those numbers don't come from critical acclaim, they come from people wanting to own a piece of something that meant something to them, which is a different kind of endorsement entirely. I want to go back and spend a bit more time with specific episodes because we've talked about the golden era in fairly broad strokes, and I think the particulars are worth knowing. Not a list. South Park episodes don't work as a list. They work as individual pieces of television that deserve individual attention. But a few more. Scott Tenorman Must Die we've covered. But I want to mention something about that episode that doesn't always get discussed, which is its structure. It looks, for most of its runtime, like a fairly standard Cartman episode. Cartman got taken advantage of. Cartman is trying to get revenge. The revenge schemes keep failing. The format is so familiar that you relax into it. You're not expecting anything unusual because the episode has done nothing to signal that anything unusual is coming. The reveal works as well as it does, partly because of how long and how carefully the episode has lulled you into thinking you know what kind of story it is. Casu Bonito, Season 7, is an episode about Cartman faking an apocalyptic meteor strike to prevent Kyle from taking someone else to a Mexican restaurant Cartman desperately wants to visit. The restaurant is real. It existed in the Denver area and actually was the kind of garish, enormous, slightly chaotic Mexican-American food venue the episode depicts. The restaurant has since closed and reopened and become a kind of pilgrimage destination for South Park fans, which is a level of real-world impact that most television episodes never achieve. The episode is a love letter to a specific type of restaurant, filtered through the particular lunacy of what Cartman will do to get what he wants. Raisins, also Season 7, is one of the most unexpectedly affecting episodes in the show's run. Stan and Wendy break up. Stan is depressed. The episode follows his genuine unhappiness rather than satirizing it, which is unusual for South Park. There's a moment late in the episode where Stan and Butters are sitting outside at night, and Butters is explaining to Stan why being sad about something is actually okay, because it means you cared about it. Butters, of all characters, delivering the emotional core of an episode about heartbreak. The scene lands because the show has spent years establishing Butters as the genuinely sincere character in a cast of guarded, ironic people. When he says something earnest, it carries weight. The return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers. Season 6, which I mentioned earlier as the 3rd highest rated episode, deserves more than a number. The plot is about the boys accidentally receiving an adult film mixed in with the Lord of the Rings DVDs their parents had rented, and the subsequent attempt to prevent the tape from corrupting the town. It's structured as a genuine fantasy adventure story. The tone and pacing are borrowed from Tolkien rather than parodied, while also being about the way children process exposure to adult material that finds its way into their hands. The film itself is never shown and never described in detail. The episode's horror at the tape is played completely straight, and in being played straight, it becomes funnier and also more honest about the subject than any direct approach would have been. Margaritaville, the season 13, is the episode that won the Emmy in 2009, and it's a sharply constructed piece of economic satire. Set during the 2008 financial crisis, the episode creates a parallel between the American consumer economy and a religion, with Randy as the prophet of austerity who tells the town to give up all their earthly possessions as penance for their financial sins. Kyle becomes a kind of economic messiah figure, using his own credit card to pay off everyone's debt. The episode is clear-eyed about who pays for financial crises and who doesn't, and it was made while those events were still unfolding, which is the 6-day production cycle doing what it does best. Broadway Bro Down, season 15, is a much sillier episode. Parker's genuine love of musical theater produces an episode that argues, via Randy, that all musical theater is designed to get straight men laid, but it's worth mentioning as an example of the show indulging a very specific personal interest and somehow making it work as comedy. Parker has a genuine relationship with musical theater. He and Stone made The Book of Mormon for Broadway, which opened in 2011 and won 9 Tony Awards, which is itself a remarkable thing to have happened in the middle of running South Park. The musical about Mormonism won more Tonys than any musical of that year. Parker and Stone, it turns out, are actually very good at writing musicals. You're Getting Old, which I mentioned briefly earlier, is season 15, and it's a different kind of episode. The episode opens like a standard South Park story. It's Stan's 10th birthday party at Whistlin' Willie's, where he gets a tween wave CD that sounds like literal diarrhea. But as the episode develops, something happens. Stan reaches his 10th birthday. He looks at the world, and suddenly everything looks and sounds like excrement to him. He can't find anything funny or interesting or good. The episode ends with his parents announcing they're separating, the friend group fracturing, and Stan alone as the Fleetwood Mac song Landslide plays over a montage of his house being emptied. It's the most personal episode Parker has ever made, and it shows. The episode doesn't announce its emotional content, it just executes it with a quietness that South Park almost never employs. When the music plays over the final montage, it hits in a way that a lot of people didn't see coming, having presumably settled in to watch a normal South Park episode. The subsequent episode, Asperger's, functioned as an unofficial sequel, and sort of retreated from the bleakness. Stan's cynicism is explained as a medical condition and is largely resolved, which frustrated fans who'd found the unresolved sadness of You're Getting Old more honest. But together they form the closest thing South Park has to a genuine emotional arc. And they say something real about the relationship between comedy and the depressive flatness that can come from seeing through everything. One more episode worth a quiet mention. Best Friends Forever. Season 9, which won the Emmy in 2005. The episode is a parody of the Terry Schiavo case, with Kenny in a persistent vegetative state and the whole town divided over whether to remove his feeding tube. It's an episode that walks an extraordinarily difficult tonal line. It has to be genuinely satirical about a real cultural moment without being callous about what the real situation involved for real people. And it pulls it off, partly because the show had spent enough time building genuine feeling for Kenny that his presence in the episode isn't just a gag. The Emmy recognition was, in this case, well judged. And finally, Tweak X Craig, Season 19, which is an unusual episode in a number of ways. The plot involves the school's Asian students drawing fan art pairing Tweak and Craig as a romantic couple, and the boys trying to break up the relationship without success. The episode is gentle in a way South Park isn't always gentle. It lets Tweak and Craig exist with some dignity, and it's now notable for being the episode that, according to the fan community, established Tweek and Craig as a canon couple in the show, a status the show has subsequently maintained. The voice performance that year, Matt Stone voicing Craig, was Emmy nominated. It's been a long journey tonight through 28 seasons and a VHS tape and a paper cutout pilot and an Oscar nomination and a billion-dollar streaming deal and the cult of Cthulhu and a very bad chili cook-off and all the rest of it. I've been thinking about South Park for a few hours now, and one of the things I keep coming back to is how strange it is that it still exists. I don't mean that as a criticism, I mean it genuinely. The conditions that produced South Park, two young guys from Colorado, a short film made for almost no money, a cable network that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. Those conditions don't produce something that runs for nearly 3 decades, that becomes one of the most profitable animated franchises in history, that gets its own specials and video games and a $1.5 billion contract and is still generating its biggest premiere audiences in 2025. Those conditions normally produce a blip, a cult favorite, something that people remember fondly and then it goes away. South Park didn't go away. And I think the reason it didn't go away is something that's easy to miss in all the noise about controversy and shock value and offensive content. The reason is that Parker and Stone genuinely cared about what the show was saying. Not just that they wanted to be provocative, anyone can be provocative, it's not a skill, but that they had actual things to say about the world and they cared about saying them well and they kept finding new things to say. The show at its best is a show about how absurd the world is and how most of the adults in it are making it more absurd through a combination of cowardice and self-interest and tribalism, and the desperate need to believe they're on the right side of history. And the show at its best is also about 4 boys who somehow persist through all of that, who go home and do homework and argue with each other and come back to the bus stop in the morning, who haven't aged, which means they'll never have to stop going back to the bus stop. That image, the bus stop, the snow, the 4 of them standing there, is probably the most iconic visual in the show's history. It's in the opening credits. It begins almost every episode, 4 small figures in the cold facing the camera in their winter coats and hats. They've been standing there since August 1997. They'll probably still be standing there at the end of the decade because the deal says so, and probably past that because the show seems incapable of finishing. There's something almost comforting about that, actually. In a world where everything changes constantly and nothing stays the way you remember it, and all your favorite things eventually end. There is a small mountain town in Colorado where 4 9-year-olds have been waiting for the school bus for nearly 30 years, and they're still waiting. And they'll probably keep waiting. Kyle still has things to care about. Cartman still has schemes to run. Kenny is still in the orange parka, and he's fine. He's always fine, at least until the next time he isn't. And even then, he'll be fine again in the morning. And Stan is still standing there with that particular expression he has, somewhere between bemused and defeated, looking at the world and thinking that this probably shouldn't be happening. And nevertheless, here we all are. All right, I think it's time. If you've made it this far, genuinely thank you for the company. And if you drifted off somewhere back in the controversies section, or during the member berries theory, or right around the bit about the 6-day production cycle, that's completely fine. That's the whole idea. Sleep well, the bus stop will still be there in the morning.